Hello there. Welcome to video 157 from Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And do remember to like and share this video too. To make your task a little easier, here is a complete list of all the 157 videos available on my YouTube channel. The list is divided into the playlists under which they are available. Do have a look. In this video, we shall study the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. This is a law which was first enacted to tackle bubonic plague in Mumbai. The law is meant for containment of epidemics by providing special powers that are required for the implementation of containment measures to control the spread of the disease. It was first passed to contain the spread of plague, which took thousands of lives in India at the time. This was passed to give municipal bodies and local government extraordinary powers to provide for better prevention and control of a spreading epidemic in India. As the plague assumed epidemic proportions, the colonial response was typical, one driven by panic and high-handedness, ill planning, and extreme measures. The Epidemic Diseases Act was a result of stringent measures which Queen Victoria had directed her government to take in order to tackle the plague outbreak. The Act has been routinely used to contain various diseases in India, such as swine flu, cholera, malaria, and dengue. In 2015, it was used to deal with dengue and malaria in Chandigarh. And in 2009, it was invoked in Pune to combat swine flu. In 2018, the Act was enforced as cholera began to spread in a region of Gujarat. And starting March 2020, the Act is being enforced across India to limit the spread of coronavirus disease during the COVID-19 pandemic. India has witnessed many large outbreaks of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases in the recent past. The outbreak of a cholera epidemic strain in 1992, that of plague in Surat in 1994, the large-scale spread of chikungunya and dengue fever, and that of avian influenza and pandemic. Remember H1N1 influenza, with some which caused widespread havoc. The resurgence of diphtheria and the outbreaks caused by the encephalitis viruses and the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever also posed a threat to the country's public health in the recent past. The emergence of drug-resistant tuberculosis and malaria organisms is also a matter of concern for the country. Diseases with the potential for international spread, such as Ebola and Zika virus, also pose threats to the public health security of India. Legal frameworks are important during emergency situations as they can delineate the scope of the government's responses to public health emergencies and also the duties and rights of citizens. In recent years, many states in India have invoked various provisions of the Act to force H1N1 affected persons to be segregated and get themselves treated at recognized hospitals, to direct private hospitals to set up isolation treatment facilities, and to notify cases of dengue and H1N1. Right, now let us study some of the provisions of the Act. The Epidemic Diseases Act is one of the shortest acts in India, comprising just 4 sections. The first section explains the title and the extent, while the second gives powers to the central and state governments to take special measures and formulate regulations that are to be observed by the people to contain the spread of the disease. When the state government believes that the state is under the threat of an outbreak of a dangerous disease and that the ordinary provisions of the law are insufficient to control the spread of such disease, then it has the power to take any measures and empower any person to control the spread. Such additional measures and powers would be informed to the public at large, and they are required to follow these temporary regulations. The state can also make rules regarding the incurring of expenses and compensation to victims. Persons who may act as spreaders of diseases can be isolated in hospitals or temporary accommodations. When the central government is under the impression that there is a threat of the spread of a contagious disease within the territory of India and feels that the laws in force are not sufficient to contain the spread of disease, then it has the powers to make rules and regulations for the inspection of any ship or vessel arriving and departing from any port in India. The third section describes penalties for violating the regulations in accordance with Section 188 of the Indian Penal Code 1860. If any disobedience by a person causes or tends to cause danger to human life, health, or safety, then they may be punished with imprisonment up to 6 months and or a fine up to rupees 1,000. The act was executed vigorously to control the plague epidemic that broke out in the 1890s. The powers it conferred were invoked to search for suspected plague cases in homes and among passengers. There was forcible segregation of affected persons, disinfections, evacuation, and demolition of infected places. The assembly of crowds was prevented. Public meetings and festivals were banned, and pilgrimages suspended. Alleged humiliation, including public strippings of and violence against women, gave rise to concern among the citizens, and riots were reported in some areas. In many places, military powers were used to ensure the proper implementation of the preventive measures. The fourth deals with legal protection to the implementing officers acting under the Act. It states that no suit or legal proceedings can be initiated against any person acting under the authorities provided in this Act and in good faith. So, has this Act been amended? Yes. This Act was amended by way of an ordinance by the President of India, adding Section 1A to the Act, providing certain important definitions like act of violence, healthcare, service profession, and property. This was to address the violence against healthcare personnel in our country. Section 2A of the Act has been amended to increase the scope of the Government of India to include bus, train, and aircraft, along with the term vessel, to make special regulations to stop its arrival or departure from India, or to detain persons traveling from or to India in such vessels. Now, coming to Section 3, this has been amended and two more subsections have been added to it. A provision has been made to punish anyone for any act of violence against healthcare professionals, either by a minimum of 3 months imprisonment, extendable to 5 years, and or a minimum fine of rupees 50,000, extendable to rupees 2 lakhs. So be careful. Don't try and beat up your doctor or the medical staff. You can go into a lot of trouble. Secondly, any person who commits the crime of grievous hurt against healthcare personnel will be punished with imprisonment of 6 years, extendable to 7 years, and a minimum fine of rupees 1 lakh, extendable to rupees 5 lakhs. Further, sections 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D, and 3E have been added to the Act. These provide for trial of offences, composition, and burden of proof regarding such offences. The burden of proof has now been shifted to the accused. That is, you have to prove yourself innocent. The burden of proof has, as I said, has been shifted. Besides, even the intention will be presumed on part of the accused. The last provision provides for paying compensation in addition to the fine as provided. This compensation will be determined by the courts. For any damage to property, the compensation shall be, hold your breath, twice the fair market value of the property. Of course, there are some limitations of the Epidemic Diseases Act in the changed context. The Act was formulated in 1897 and thus has major limitations in this era of changing priorities in public health emergency management. The factors leading to the emergence and spread of communicable diseases have also changed over the years. Some of the factors that need to be addressed now are increasing international travel, more extensive use of air travel compared to sea travel, greater migration within states for the sake of earning a livelihood, the transition from agrarian to industrial societies, increased urbanization, and grossly increased density of populations in certain areas. Other factors to be kept in mind are increasing intensity of contact with animals and birds, man-made ecological changes, changes climatic conditions, technologies of mass food production, breakdown of public health measures, and biosafety lapses. The Epidemic Diseases Act, therefore, needs modifications in the changing scenario. The Epidemic Diseases Act is not in line with the contemporary scientific understanding of outbreak prevention and response, but only reflects the scientific and legal standards that prevailed at the time when it was framed. To cite an example, the Act places too much emphasis on isolation or quarantine measures, but is silent on the other scientific methods of outbreak prevention and control, such as vaccination, surveillance, and organized public health response. The political scenario in the country and center-state relationships have changed. The Act of 1897, as such, is not sufficient to deal with the prevention and control of communicable disease in the current situation. The definition or description of a dangerous epidemic disease is not provided in the Act. There is no clear definition of whether an epidemic is dangerous on the basis of the magnitude of the problem, the severity of the problem, the age of the population affected, or its potential to spread internationally. It is essential to know who decides on what a dangerously epidemic disease is and what criteria the definition is based on. The Epidemic Diseases Act is purely regulatory in nature and lacks a specific public health focus. It does not describe the duties of the government in preventing and controlling epidemics. The Act emphasizes the power of the government but is silent on the rights of citizens. It has no provisions that take people's interests into consideration. The Act is also silent on the ethical aspects or human rights principles that come into play during the response to an epidemic. Individual autonomy, liberty, and privacy should be respected to the greatest extent possible, even during the enforcement of laws. It would have been good if the Act stated clearly the situations under which the authorities may curtail the autonomy, privacy, liberty, and property rights of the people, thus helping to reduce the community's misperceptions. Given that the private sector accounts for nearly 70% of India's healthcare, this sector has a crucial role to play in supporting the traditional public sector-led response to the prevention and tackling of outbreaks. There are many successful public-private partnership models in healthcare, and the lessons learned from these need to be incorporated for better private sector participation in communicable disease control. During epidemics, there should be provisions in the Act to maintain standards in quality of care, rationality of treatment, cost of care, treatment protocol, and ethical behavior applicable to both public and private sectors. These need to be regulated through bodies with the involvement of people from both sectors and mutually agreeable professional organizations. There is a need to strengthen legal frameworks to prevent and control the entry, spread, and existence of communicable diseases in India. The Epidemic Diseases Act 1897, which is more than a century old, has major limitations when it comes to tackling the emergence and re-emergence of communicable diseases in the country, especially in the changing public health context. There is a need for an integrated, comprehensive, actionable, and relevant legal provision for the control of outbreaks in India that should be articulated in a rights-based, people-focused, and public health-oriented manner. Now, let us have a look at the Act during the present coronavirus pandemic. As the coronavirus pandemic engulfed the country, this Act was invoked along with the provisions of the Disaster Management Act to control the spread of the virus. Most states such as Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra and Bihar notified regulations under the Act authorizing government officials to admit, isolate and quarantine people in certain situations. Drawing from the Act, many states took measures such as the closing of schools, malls, gyms, institutional and home quarantine in order to mitigate the crisis. The Act was amended by way of an ordinance in April 2020. The amendment aimed primarily at protecting healthcare personnel engaged in combating the coronavirus and expanded powers of the central government to prevent the spread of such diseases. It was passed by both houses of parliament and received the assent of the President on 28th of September 2020, thereby bringing into effect the Epidemic Diseases Amendment Act 2020. It is clear that India has fallen short in ensuring a modern legal framework to tackle a pandemic. Instead of relying upon colonial era laws, using brute force in enforcing quarantine and lockdown measures, and resorting to provisions like Section 144 Code of Criminal Procedure, that is CRPC, a new law is required to address the lacuna in the existing structure. The time is ripe to repeal this colonial law and replace it with a more comprehensive, modern, and ethically robust law which focuses on a rights-based, public health-oriented approach. Well, that's all from me in this video. This video is based on the information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject and not for any financial gain. Do like and share this video and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. Till later then, cheerio.